Okay, all. So we're going to be talking about the first years of the Republic today. So I hope you've been doing the readings and you can remember what we're going to be discussing. So after the Constitution is ratified in 1789, you have the formation of these um, really first political parties, right? The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists really are sort of your New Englanders in a large respect, I suppose, but they see the Constitution as um, groups that are. They see the Constitution as something that is important to protecting the strength of the federal government, hence the name the Federalists. They are often, as I say on the slide here, they are often people who live in the more settled areas, right? They're your New Yorkers, your Bostonians. Now, they are um, they are first really growing out of this new question of sort of what is the country going to look like, and people are questioning sort of what role is government going to play in the rising republic, right? As you move westward from these sort of settled eastern territories and move west into the Pennsylvanias and the Kentuckys and further into these frontier regions, we're becoming less and less connected to the settled areas of the East. And the question really needs to become, what do we see the role of that government? And that's really sort of the point of today's class, right? This idea of how do we project the westward. Now, the problem with the government is establishing this sort of necessary evil, as I say. Government was seen as something that was many people who were skeptical of, but it was a question of so the population was growing very rapidly, and the government is changing to adopt to this. So most people live at this point in a rural environment, but when we're talking about urban environments, we're talking very, very small places. But most places are, again, most people are living in very rural environments, making their living not through artisans and trade, but really through agriculture. So into that, you sort of get President Washington, right? Washington comes to power in 1789 as the first elected president of the United States under this Constitution, right? There had been other presidents. John Hancock had been a president. There had been other presidents under the Articles of Confederation, but under the 1789 Constitution, Washington is our first, hence our first president. Now, much of what he does sets a precedent for the rest of the groups of people, the rest of the presidents that will follow him. And he understands this role that he takes, right? So he establishes this first cabinet, right? So he brings in some big names here, right? Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State, a fellow Virginian. Alexander Hamilton, the famed financial studier, comes in as the first Secretary of the Treasury, right, of Lin-Manuel Miranda fame. And then Henry Knox, right, is the Secretary of War. John Adams is his vice president. So he has a pretty good group of people to help him out, right? Jefferson is a Virginian. Hamilton is a New Yorker, immigrant to the country from the Caribbean, and Henry Knox is from Massachusetts. He has a guy named Edmund Randolph as his Attorney General, so he has a pretty good group of people around him. James Madison, who was a young Virginian working in the House of Representatives at the time, really is tasked with the idea of developing this Bill of Rights. What list of rights are we going to give people in this new nation that cannot be taken away? So Madison starts to work on the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. Now, these Bill of Rights are there to protect certain rights, but again, it is seen as a way that the federal government is overreaching its boundaries. But Madison, who is a who's a Federalist, he likes this idea, and Washington does too. And although Washington doesn't necessarily say that he's a member of a party, he's pretty Federalist in his policies. Now, the sort of two sides of the issue here is that Federalists see this as something that is necessary to protect the rights of the overreaching government. But Democratic Republicans, the sort of name taken by the Anti-Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, see this as giving the government too much power, right? Because if we are telling the government that they have access to these, just because we don't say you have these rights doesn't mean you don't have these rights. So leaving it more to the individual. Finally, these Bill of Rights are obviously passed. They are passed in 1791, and they become the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and they establish this control by they protect rights from the government, right? Another thing that happens here, right, and that is that there is a push to solidify the federal judiciary, right? States can set up their own courts, so we have state courts today, and state courts are established in the 1780s, but no real rule is given to sort of establishing a federal judiciary. So in 1789, the Congress passes the Judiciary Act, and this establishes a United States Supreme Court that will meet to decide constitutionality. It also gives the Congress the ability to establish federal and district courts, and it gives the ability of establishing an attorney general. Now, the first Supreme Court justice is a guy named John Jay, who had been a member of the Continental Congress, and he works his way into this new role. Now, the Supreme Court is not this sort of entity that we think of it today. The Supreme Court in the 1780s, 1790s, even up until the 1800s, was a really ragtag group, not meaning that they were sort of unqualified. They were certainly qualified men, because they were all men. But they didn't have a central location, so they sort of bopped around the countryside holding their court, because they also had to judge different circuits around the country. So they had to go around the different areas to judge different cases. And this was something that they did throughout the period. Up until John Marshall becomes the Supreme Court Justice in 1804, I believe, he's the one who really starts to direct this, right? But this was a really rough job where you had to sort of jump around the countryside, doing different hearing different cases. Obviously, there were cases that the Supreme Court heard in total, right? All 6 members, but the Supreme Court was really rough for the first couple of years of it. So Alexander Hamilton comes up with this plan, right? The states and the government are burdened by this financial debt of the American Revolution. So what happened is Hamilton decides that he's going to assume the federal government is going to assume state debt. And the reason that he's going to do this is because he believes that it will give confidence in the American government, right? If we can purchase the debt, basically using federal government bonds, purchase the debt, then we will be able to sort of protect the people that are in the United States, but it also gives people in the United States the way of sort of saying, like, we are invested in this enterprise. So Hamilton comes up with that plan, and he's also going to do another thing, which is he's going to try and raise taxes through an excise tax, which I'll talk about in just a second. But this is really unpopular in some places, right? In places like the South that have relatively low debt, that have paid it off, Virginia, the Carolinas, they hate this plan. But for high debt places like Massachusetts and New York, they are far more willing to. But there is a compromise that is passed, right? The federal government will buy up the debt, particularly from these northern cities, but the capital has to move down south. It has to move to Virginia, essentially. And that's where the District of Columbia, D.C., comes into play. So they're going to raise tax through an excise tax. They're going to charge tax on whiskey. Now, the problem with this is that for a lot of people who are agriculture and growing their corn, they're taking the excess corn and they're turning it into whiskey, right? So this is a way for me to take my surplus, which might otherwise spoil and not be usable. I am now taking it and I am turning it into something that I can barter with and sell. So if you are going to charge me tax on that, you are really hurting my financial ability. Now, for a lot of people, particularly people living in rural environments, this becomes a major problem. So in 1794, as a response to the rising problems of the whiskey debate, there's a whiskey rebellion. And the whiskey rebellion occurs largely in western Pennsylvania, and it is a way for these rural folk to fight against this tax that is put on these people in the rural areas. George Washington, president at the time, decides that he's going to really suppress this and show the power of the federal government to raise taxes as it needs, and he crushes this rebellion with 13,000 troops. He is at the leader of it, right? He's the one who is leading the charge, if you will, and he cleans up this rebellion. It also is a problem, right? Because these rural folk are attacking. Were attacking courthouses and judges, so it was really, really quite brutal. So this is one way that the United States is able to put up with and show the sort of trouble of the the sort of supremacy of the federal government. All of this leads to sort of the emergence of political parties, right? You have Hamilton, who is arguing for a strong centralized government, and you have Jefferson, who is looking for a more agrarian, less powerful central government. The disagreements here are creating the first political parties. One, a largely northern, large city federalist group led by Hamilton, and one, a more agricultural, agrarian group led by Thomas Jefferson. They split up on sort of the big issue of power to the federal government, but they also split on other things. Views on the French Revolution, right? Jefferson, a Francophile and a Francophone, supports the French Revolution. Hamilton, John Adams, they support more of an English, British view. And so there's this, again, this sort of, they separate based on different ideologies. Finally, the sort of last big thing here is, what do we get from Washington, right? Washington leaves office in 1797, replaced by John Adams in 1798. And when he is president, Washington really wants to support this idea of neutrality, right? Stay out of European affairs. And he supports this idea through the rest of his life, right? I mean, he doesn't live very long after he leaves the presidency. But it's all about this idea of neutrality. Okay, so we've seen here the sort of large debate of the early Washington years, and that's really what I wanted you to get out of for tonight. We'll see a little bit more in a couple of days.